Good evening, everyone. My name is Goedele Nuyttens. I'm working for VUB Crosstalks, and I'm honored to welcome you tonight to the third installment of our series, More Than Human Encounters, which we set up together with Kai Theater. This series seeks to situate human to more than human relations and conditions of liberation and coexistence in a world that has been modeled in the ever-present contest of imperialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. This evening, we will explore how speciesism and ableism intersect and how they operate in relation to other isms in a system of oppression. If certain abilities are the prerequisite to include other animals into the circle of moral consideration, what ethical and practical implications does this hold for humans who don't possess these abilities? Do animal ethics or veganism need to be cribbed? And what implications does this have for animal rights activism? We will start the evening with a lecture by Geertrui Cazaux. Geertrui has been advocating for the rights of other animals since 25 years. After her doctoral thesis on anthropocentrism and speciesism in criminology, she worked in youth care and as a policy advisor. She's now retired because of chronic diseases, and together with her husband, she takes care of adopted animals at her home. She's the editor of Mensen en andere dieren, a book that was published in 2001, and a second book that came out recently, only last year in 2020, the book called Een ander soort zuster. She also writes about veganism and animal rights on Graswortels and on Bruges Vegan. And she writes about the interconnections between ableism and speciesism on the blog Cripping. In her lecture, Geertrui will discuss how other animals than humans resist their oppression by escaping, by retaliating, or by other acts of resistance. According to Geertrui, centering other animals and sharing their stories helps us move away from a human saviorist framing. Animals are not voiceless, and we're not their saviors, but their allies. I would like to stress that this lecture, the lecture by Geertrui, is pre-recorded, so Geertrui will not be participating at the discussion here later this evening at Kai Studios, but she will follow the lecture and the discussion from home. So if there are any questions for her in particular, you can always put them in the chat, and then Geertrui will try to answer them directly. Or if you want to ask her something more in private, you can always contact her through her blog or her website. So I will now just leave the floor to Geertrui.
Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or maybe good morning from wherever in the world you are watching. I will be giving a presentation about animal resistance and about human saviorism and not so voiceless animals. Now, in animal rights activism, we often focus on the plight of millions or even billions of animals who are abused, who are exploited. Other animals are used in food production, they are used in entertainment, in circuses, in zoos. They are used for food, for clothing and scientific experiments, and also their habitat is destroyed, changed, or invaded. Now, what is less often focused on in animal activism and animal advocacy is the fact that animals also resist their oppression, their exploitation. So I will be sharing some stories of animal resistance, so animals who resist their oppression. And animals resist in numerous ways. They resist by escaping or by trying to escape. They resist by not cooperating. They resist even by acts of retaliation and other acts of everyday resistance. So I will be sharing some stories of animal resistance. And the first story is in Poland and occurred in 2018. And on a winter day in February, there was a farmer who was rounding up the cows some cows to go to the slaughterhouse, to be taken to the slaughterhouse to be killed. And he had already warned the handlers who were taking the cows to the truck that there was one cow in particular that would be a bit aggressive maybe, that was not difficult, that was not easy to handle, that was difficult. So he had warned them, but and he had said, yeah, maybe you should sedate the cow, but they didn't take his warning into account. And effectively, the cow, she resisted, and she managed to break loose, and in the process, she ran over one of the handlers and broke his arm. And then she rammed into a metal fence and opened the fence, and she ran and ran till she reached a lake nearby, and she saw the water, and without hesitation, she jumped into the water and she started swimming. And after a couple of minutes, she reached an island in the middle of the lake, and there she came ashore, and she went into the woods of the island. The farmer, the days after, he went to the island several times to try and catch the cow, to take her back to his farm again, and eventually to the slaughterhouse. But he didn't manage, so he gave up, but he did return a couple of times to the island to leave food for the cow. And a couple of days later, he tried again with the firefighters from the village. They went on a boat to the island, but when the cow saw the firefighters approach, she dipped again into the water and she swam to the peninsula of the island, and she managed to escape again. So they rather gave up, and they said, yeah, maybe in the future we can try again. But meanwhile, the story of this cow was picked up by local media and went viral on social media, and even went international. And a lot of people said, we want to spare the life of this cow, and she was named Cow Hero. So here you see a screenshot of a newspaper article, "Hero Cow Escapes Abattoir in Poland by Swimming to Island." So this cow received a lot of media attention, and a lot of people also stepped in to say, we want to spare the life of this cow, we don't want her to be taken to the slaughterhouse. So there was a local governor, a local politician who stepped in and said, okay, I want to give a sanctuary to this cow, she can come and live with me on my farm, and she will not go to the slaughterhouse, and she can live out her natural lifespan with me. So a couple of weeks later, they went to the island to do a sort of rescue operation. But they had to chase the cow for several hours because she didn't want to be caught, and they had to sedate her several times. And these are a couple of photos of the so-called rescue operation. Here you can see on both photos that her tongue is sticking out, and they put a rope around her neck, and in the process also one of her horns was broken off. But they managed to take her into the boat and put her on transport to the farm where she would be given sanctuary. But unfortunately, she never made it there, because during transport she died. But the story touched a lot of people all over the world, and also her story was able to bring attention to the plight of animals on farms, cows who resist and escape and want to live. And she managed to live freely for 4 weeks on that island. Another story is from an orang-utan in Borneo in Indonesia. Now, this was a short video clip that was already shot. The images were already shot in 2013, but the images went viral in 2018 when it was used in a documentary by David Attenborough, Climate Change, The Facts. And we can see on the footage, this is a screenshot from that short clip. It was filmed by the International Animal Rescue Organization. And we can see on the short clip, the orang-utan is running across this tree. There's a logging operation in process, so they are clearing the forest. There's deforestation. And you can see the orang-utan running across the tree and actually hitting the bulldozer, the crane, in an effort to try and stop the logging operation. This is another screenshot from that video where you actually can see the orang-utan slamming the bulldozer. So the International Animal Rescue Organization already filmed this in 2013. As I said, the images went viral then in 2018 after they were used in that documentary. On the end of the video, you can see the orangutan falling off the tree and running into the forest, and it's unclear to me whether the orangutan was able to be brought into safety or not, because the International Animal Rescue Organization, they focus on relocating animals of whose habitat has been destroyed. But this video, again, it went viral all over the world via social media, and it was able to bring attention to the plight of animals in rainforest where there's destruction of their habitat. Another story is from a tiger in 2003. She was born in 2003, and the story occurs, the incident occurs in 2007 in the zoo of San Francisco. So by that time, she was 4 years old, and what happened was that she managed to jump over the ditch and jump across the wall that enclosed her small enclosure in the zoo. And she immediately grabbed one of 3 boys, young men who were visiting the zoo. And she grabbed one and she killed one, and the other 2, there were 3 of them together. They ran away and they were able to hide for a short while in the zoo cafe. But after she had killed one boy, she went around the zoo looking for the 2 other boys. And she passed by many other visitors of the zoo, but she was specifically looking for these boys, because what became apparent afterwards is that these 3 young men, one of them was 17, so boys actually, had been taunting her, had been shouting at her, reportedly maybe even throwing things at her. So she was really specifically looking for them in an act of retaliation. Now, when she found them at the zoo cafe, she also attacked the boys, but by that time the police had arrived on the scene and they shot her dead. But that was also a story that went viral, that received a lot of media attention and brought attention also to the plight of animals who are used in zoos or in entertainment. Now, the animal industrial complex, and by that I mean the complex where animals are used for entertainment, in food production, they will most often frame such incidents as very occasional accidents, that those incidents that it is very rare, that they are abnormal, that doesn't occur normally. Or they will frame it as animals gone crazy, as animals gone insane, as animals who have gone wild. So that also has an ableist component. Or they will say, oh, the animals were just following their instinct, and as such, denying the agency of the animals. And another thing they will most often use in the narrative around such incidents, such occasional accidents in their words, is that it was the fault of the design of the enclosure, or that it was the fault of the handler or the trainer when it occurs in circuses, and that this will be fixed, that the trainers will receive a more professional training, that will be trained more professionally, and that it will not happen again. But what we do know, and what is also apparent in the literature, I will show you a couple of books later on, is that these sorts of incidents of animal resistance, they happen all the time. They are certainly not rare, and they are certainly not abnormal. There are so many stories of animal resistance that don't make the headlines, that don't make it into the news, that are kept out of the news on purpose. For example, this is mentioned in the book by Jason Hribel, Fear of the Animal Planet. After a tiger attack in a Russian circus, when asked to a trainer whether they would kill the tiger, the trainer said, if we were to kill every tiger that attacks us, there wouldn't be any left. So to show that such incidents happen all the time. So with framing these stories as occasional accidents, the industry, the animal industrial complex, is diverting attention away from the structural exploitation that animals have to endure day in, day out. Animals are separated from their family. They are kept in solitary confinement, and so many other ways in which they are exploited. But by framing these incidents as just occasional and rare, and it won't happen again, they are trying to divert attention away from that. And there are indeed so many stories of animal resistance. I'm only telling a couple of stories here in this presentation, and that is even despite the fact that humans make it very difficult for other animals to resist by enclosing them, because we have to make really good fences to enclose, to keep the animals inside the buildings, inside the enclosures, by punishing every wrong move, by using tools to punish them, for example, bull hooks that are used for the training of elephants, nose rings that are used on bulls, on cows, by mutilating their bodies and also by disabling their bodies so that the animals can't escape. Think, for example, of the clipping of the wings of chickens. Now, clipping is actually a very euphemistic term. It's actually just cutting off the wings of the chickens so that they cannot fly anymore. And also by making them more docile. So the process of domestication is a process of choosing those animals to breed who show less resistance, choosing those animals to breed who cooperate. So eventually you get animals who are less, who will resist less. So I think, and the point of my presentation is that I think in animal activism we should focus on changing that narrative around such incidents. These are not stories of animals who have gone mad, but it is very normal behavior of animals showing us that they don't agree with their oppression, that they do fight back. And these are often acts of rebellion against their oppression. And I also think we should bring the larger story into the picture. Their resistance, it doesn't come out of the blue. It's not just like they snap and there is no history before that. These are not one-off accidents. There is a long prior history of abuse and exploitation before that specific accident or incident of animal resistance. So as such, I think we should also be focusing more on telling the story from the animal point of view, from the animal's point of view, and show their agency in the process. My final story that I have is from Tyke. I will wait a minute to show you the photo of Tyke. Now, Tyke was a 21-year-old elephant who was brought at a very young age. She was taken from her homeland, from her habitat in Africa. I think it was from Mozambique. And at a very young age, she was brought to the United States to perform in the circus over there in the entertainment industry. So her life must have been a lot of punishment, a lot of the use of the bull hook to train her, to make her perform, to do tricks. Also, most of her life probably she spent chained up inside the circuses, traveling from one place to the other. And on one of such occasions, they had been traveling to Hawaii, to Honolulu, to perform there in August 1994. And there's video footage of this, what happened that day. And in the preparation for this presentation, I went to look up the video footage again, and it's really horrible footage. It's really very touching. And we can see there's somebody in the audience because the circus was fully packed. It's a full house with an audience, and we can see her coming into the ring, and there are two handlers who are trying to calm her. But she runs over them and she plays like football with them. And actually one of the trainers gets killed in the process. So both men lie there on the ground. And she is playing, sort of playing with them. But it was actually an act of retaliation, you could say. And then suddenly she realizes, yeah, this is not going to go well. I will be probably thinking I will be severely punished for this. And then she sees the door of the circus tent where she can go out. And she runs out, and the next footage we've seen is taken outside. There's the fence of the circus, and she rams the fence. There's somebody trying to keep her in, but he can't hold her force. And by that time, the police has also come to the scene, and they start chasing her. And here, this is a photo from when she is running through the streets of Honolulu, through the city. And she runs and runs for her life. And on the video footage, you can also see that she is really distressed, that she is panicking, not knowing where to go, but just running for her life. And at a certain point, the police managed to enclose her with several cars, and then she is shot several times. And on this video footage, you can see her slowly, gradually going down, and life is disappearing from her. And it took 86 bullets. They shot 86 bullets at her before, and then eventually she went down. But she wasn't even killed then. They brought in veterinarians from the zoo to give her lethal injections, but even with those, she wasn't killed. And it took another couple of shots before she was killed. And this is a very strong picture. This is the moment when she was actually shot. And there is also video footage of this, but it's really horrible to watch. When you see her going down, it's really horrible. But what the story of Tyke, as I said, this incident, it was shown all over the world, but this was in 1994, so this was pre-internet days, or at least the internet was just in its beginning stages. It was pre-social media days, so there was no Facebook and Instagram and such, but it was shown in I think, every news report all over the world, and I actually do remember when this was on TV, and I remember that footage. And it led to an enormous, massive international protest against the use of wild animals in circuses and support for animal rights. So a lot of people show their support because of this story, because of what happened to Tyke. And actually, it also led to the ban of the use of wild animals in circuses in several cities and countries around the world. And also because of this, because there was a ban then, they had to think of what are we going to do with these animals, with these elephants and tigers and other animals. And it led to the development of elephant sanctuaries and other sanctuaries where such animals could live their life and without fear of being punished, without having to perform tricks. So the resistance of Tyke played a major role in these developments. And another point I would like to make in this presentation is that in animal advocacy and animal activism, I think we really should be careful with the language that we use. And that's a point that I've already made in other presentations as well. For example, speaking about other animals as if they are voiceless, as having no voice. And from the examples shown from animal resistance, it should be clear that animals are not voiceless. So presenting them as voiceless portrays them as passive recipients of or victims of oppression. But they do have agency and they do resist their oppression. They have voices and we should bring their voices into the conversation. And presenting them as voiceless also has an ableist component. When we say they are voiceless, we are ignoring or silencing other modes of communication. And there's a famous quote from Arundhati Roy I would like to say to you. There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And also another quote from Sunaura Taylor. Sunaura Taylor wrote the groundbreaking book Beasts of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation. And she writes, when animal advocates describe animals as voiceless, even when it is meant simply as a metaphor, it gives power to those who want to view animals as mindless objects. So even if we use it metaphorically, I think it's not a good idea to use voiceless. Other examples in language use is, for example, saying I am vegan for the animals or that we are saving animals. I think we should stress more that we are standing in solidarity with other animals in their fight against their oppression. and not present ourselves as the saviors of other animals. So we have to be careful of human saviorism. Ask yourself the question, is it about centering us, humans, or is it about the oppression of animals and raising their voices, bringing them into the picture and standing in solidarity with them? So we are not their saviors, but we are, or we should be, their allies. And by centering the stories and the voices of animals, and also by changing our language, we can deplatform ourselves and center other animals. So instead of saying, I'm vegan for the animals, and this is a point that was made by Dan Kidby in a presentation about animal resistance at VegFest in London and in Brighton as well, he proposes that we say, I'm anti-speciesist in solidarity with other animals, because you wouldn't also say, I'm feminist for the women. So instead of saying vegan for the animals, he proposes anti-speciesist in solidarity with other animals. Now, there are so many other examples of animal resistance. I have only given a couple, but if you look further in news reports, and I will also be showing some books that have documented cases of animal resistance, in some of these instances, in some of these acts of resistance, the animals do get killed, but sometimes some manage to escape. Sometimes animals end up in a sanctuary, or sometimes even they remain fugitives. And here are a couple of more examples. Monkeys escaping from laboratories where they are used in experimentation. There's Telecom, of course, and stories of other orcas who have resisted their oppression. There's a famous story also of Chautauqua, a horse in the horse racing industry who refused to race anymore. Every time the gates opened and the other horses take off, he was standing there motionless and didn't want to race anymore. And also other animals who are helping their peers in escaping by even returning sometimes after they have escaped and opening the gates for others. So many more examples. Here are some books. This is indeed an eye-opening book. It was an eye-opening book for me as well. And from Jason Hribal, he's a journalist, Fear of the Animal Planet, The Hidden History of Animal Resistance. And it documents many, many cases of animal resisting their oppression, their exploitation. And another book is much more recent. This one is only out since a couple of weeks. It's Animal Resistance in the Global Capitalist Era, and it's by Sadat Collin. And this also documents many cases of animal resistance, but has a more theoretic grounding and a more framing around it. So really recommend it. Not specifically about animal resistance, but I did want to show this book as well. It had the quote that I mentioned earlier. This is the book by Sonara Taylor, and I'm sure it will be mentioned in the rest of the program this evening. So this is Beasts of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation by Sonara Taylor, where she explores the many interconnections between speciesism and ableism and animality and disability, humanity, animality, disability. Another book that documents a case of animal resistance is the story of Topsy the elephant. Now, this happened in 1903, so more than a century ago, and Topsy was considered as having a reputation as being a bad elephant. She was also taken from in the wild in Africa and brought to the entertainment industry in America. And after having killed 3 of her handlers in the years prior, they decided to execute her. And the first plan was to hang her, actually, but after protest from the Animal Protection Society, they decided they were going to electrocute her. And also they fed her carrots with cyanide, and at the meantime they strangled her. And what is peculiar about this case is that this was also filmed. So this was in 1903, and this was filmed by the Edison Manufacturing Movie Company, and you can see the footage of this electrocution. So her execution actually, that is also online. So this book documents the whole story of what happened to Topsy. one other book, not particularly about animal resistance, but in line of the previous topic about the execution of other animals. We may think that this is like a thing of the past, and this book, The Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals, is from 1906 by Edward Peyton Evans, and he documents a lot of cases of animal execution in the Middle Ages. So it was not uncommon in the Middle Ages when, for example, a pig had run over a child and the child was killed in the process, that the pig would be brought to the prison and appointed a lawyer and would be brought before the court and eventually would be given the death sentence by hanging or stabbing or another method. And we may think of those incidents as a thing of the past, but if you look closer, and if you also think about all the incidents of animal resistance and how many of them end with an execution of the animals, it's all but a thing of the past. Think, for example, also of how so-called aggressive dogs who have, for example, bitten a child, or there's a biting incident, that they mostly end up being killed, euphemistically called euthanized, but they are also given a death sentence for committing a criminal act, in our words. Now, about animal resistance, there's also the Facebook page Animal Resistance, who has been documenting many cases of animal resistance for a couple of years already. And there's also an Italian page, Resistenza Animali, who also documents a lot of those cases. And because I think this is a topic that's so important, I have also began documenting cases of animal resistance on my Dutch page on Facebook, Graswortels. Graswortels is the literal translation of grassroots, so grassroots activism. So I've also started documenting cases of animal resistance there. And I also wanted to tell you about another platform that I have created a little over 2 years ago, and that's the platform Cripping. And there I'm exploring also the interconnections between ableism and speciesism and humanity, animality. I'm also posting a lot of interviews with disabled vegans there to share their perspectives. And there's also a contact form there, so if anybody has any questions for me, or if you want to get in touch with me, you can contact me through the site Cripping. Thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of the program. Bye.
Thank you, Geertrui, for sharing these eye-opening stories and maybe some even shocking stories with us. As I said before, you can put your questions in the chat in the Zoom. I also forgot to mention that both the discussion and the lectures are being live captioned. I'm aware that maybe the captions won't be flawless, but in like 4 weeks, in a month, beginning of April, all videos will be put online, and there will be, the names that will be spelled incorrectly will be corrected there. Our next speaker is Agnes Trzak. Agnes lives with her dog and her human companions in Berlin, in Germany, where she works as an inclusion educator for children and their adults. Her practical work is informed by the theory she explores in her writing about overlapping systems of oppression. She shows how dominant ways of constructing and representing thought, language, and the physical environment affect different marginalized humans and non-humans. Her most prominent publications include the edited volume Teaching Liberation, Essays on Social Justice, Animals, Veganism and Education, and the chapter called Disability and the A-Human in the book Disability and Animality, Crip Perspectives in Critical Animal Studies. In her lecture, Agnes will expose the dangers of using the concept of ability to justify moral consideration amongst humans and beyond constructed species barriers. She will explore the question of what happens if we use cognitive and bodily ability as a criterion to base our moral considerations on. And she will uncover how the construct of humanism in a Eurocentric capitalist context is linked to neurotypical ability. She will also share an intimate story of her relationship with her animal companions to illustrate the danger in granting less humanness, less personhood, less agency, or less value to those disabled by society, be they human or non-human. After the lecture, Olave Nduwanje and Anaïs Van Ertvelde will join us for a discussion with Agnes and with the public. If Anaïs and Olave want to share anything in particular with you about their personal lives, they're free to do that during the discussion, but I will stick to the most elementary things to introduce them. Olave Nduwanje was born in Burundi and lives in Brussels since 2019. She identifies as a non-binary trans femme. Olave is a legal scholar and an activist. And since 2019, she's also been working for Studium Generale in Ghent. She contributed to several books, one being Zwart, Afro-Europese literatuur uit de lage landen, De Goede Immigrant, and in 2020, the book Being Imposed Upon. Olave has also co-curated one of the events in this series, More Than Human Encounters. These were 3 events on multi-species justice that we organized in January. Olave isn't afraid of 1 or 2 cameras either, so you will definitely find her on Instagram, YouTube, or Twitter. And then Anaïs Van Ertvelde, she's a historian and a writer. At Leiden University, she researches the political and the artistic representation of people with disabilities. She writes essays and makes podcasts on the history of the body, gender, and sexuality. And currently, she's the visiting lecturer in semiotics at the Ghent School of Arts, KASK, while she's working on her second book for the BSRB, which will focus on crip identities. The discussion is for later. We'll now go to Berlin to welcome Agnes Trzak.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for the warm welcome and the amazing first lecture we just saw. I will get right into it as 30 minutes is not so much time, but the topic I'm here to speak about is incredibly complex. Also a heads up, I live with a dog who has just started to play, so it might get loud. He might bark from time to time. Let me give you a little bit of a prologue before my thoughts turn quite theory heavy today. When preparing for this talk, I was debating for quite a while how I should introduce myself. I believe that it is important for us to know who communicates with us and what context informs that communication. As we are coming together through our screens today, a lot of what is usually communicated through physical presence and proximity will unfortunately get lost. So I would like to say a couple of things about myself. So my name is Agnes Trzak, a Polish name I myself was not able to read any other way than Trzak as a child, German being my first language. I use she and they pronouns. If you cannot see me, I am white. In relatively short interactions with people, like the one we are having today, I am granted quite a lot of privilege. Now I would like to read you this quote by feminist disability scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson. Quote, "People with disabilities routinely announce that they do not consider themselves as disabled. Our culture offers profound disincentives and few rewards to identifying as disabled. The refusal to claim disability identity is in part due to a lack of non-oppressive ways to understand or talk about disability." I'm just checking if you can hear me because I just realized that, I don't see an audience and maybe something went wrong. Okay, then I'll continue reading the notes I have and we'll go from here. So in spaces that I am usually invited to, I rarely hesitate to speak about my own identity if it's pertinent to the conversation. I usually feel safe enough and I don't jeopardize the platform I am given by disclosing my lived experience. However, until recently, I have indeed not spoken about myself as disabled or only able through increased effort to access social and economic capital made by and for able-minded and able-bodied humans. I learned to speak about symptoms I was experiencing and understanding my condition as a naturalized one, but never being bound to the social construction of accessibility, participation, and agency in society. Foremost, however, through denying my disability, I also made use of and benefited from enormous privilege that comes from often passing and being perceived as able-bodied and able-minded. I have so perpetuated ableism. So today I will speak about ableism, this system of oppression that discriminates against disabled bodies and minds, a system that removes us from society while simultaneously examining us, opening us up, cutting us open, scanning our bodies and seeing into our brains so as to identify and name us, to medicalize us and to assimilate us. I'll also speak about speciesism, the system of oppression that discriminates against those categorized as animals or not considered human enough, individuals that are assigned species other than Homo sapiens, but also individuals categorized as Homo sapiens who might be dehumanized in the dominant socio-political context, including disabled people. The title of my talk today is The Moment We Don't or Do Compare Disability and Animality. And it is a contribution to animal liberation as much as to disability liberation. The question I was specifically invited to explore, or the questions tonight, were about the intersections between the oppression of non-human animals and disabled humans, who's granted moral consideration and who decides who will be given the right to aid, to care, to love, and dignity. To explore these questions, I find useful to think about the concept of humanness. I want to show how we dehumanize some individuals to elevate the status and moral consideration of others through a process of comparing them against each other. As this talk is very much about the intersections of identities, specifically that of disability and animality, I would like to end later by sharing a personal story about madness, disability, and a couple of cross-species relationships I found myself in. Okay, so let us think about humanness. What makes us human? Is there something that distinguishes humans from other species? What makes humans different from a stone or a rock, for example? Take a moment and without judging your own thoughts, reflect on that question. What makes you specifically human? Are you thinking about biological specificities, perhaps spiritual ones? Any specific capabilities that only humans might have? I would like to share my screen with you now. Bear with me. Oh, there we go. That's George announcing himself. Okay. No, not there yet. There we go. Can you see this? Can you see the slide? So it reads, what makes us human? And perhaps these were some of the things that you thought of. Perhaps you thought of specific human anatomy. Perhaps you thought of our capacity to reason, to plan, to reflect. The fact that we have an economy, that we exchange and consume products and technologies. Perhaps the ability to verbalize, perhaps the ability to use complex structures of grammar. The problem with these items on this list, however, is that firstly, examples of all of these can be found amongst non-human species too. And secondly, not every human engages in those actions or has these features in their lives. Generally, we tend to think about these features as distinctly human, or at least more human than animal, perhaps, or more civilized than animalistic. Let me go back to my notes. Okay. So like I said before, no judgment if any of these came up for you. Sorry, I have 3 tabs open and I'm already overwhelmed. Okay, so perhaps the idea that these are distinctly human features comes to us because we learn this. Because from a very early age, we are taught to categorize everything that we perceive into complex systems of hierarchies, where human traits are usually given more consideration, more moral consideration, and values that are more associated with animals are given less moral consideration. And when I say we, that we learn to judge these things as perhaps intrinsically human, I mean Eurocentric, capitalist, heteronormative society. Even though I oppose by choice and by nature most of the beliefs that this structure expects and rewards in us, I still am part of it, and I have internalized many of its values, including the ones that are harmful towards myself. These hierarchies are dependent on the time and place we find ourselves in. One such way we learn to create hierarchies is, for example, through language. From queer theory and disability studies scholar Mel Y. Chen, we learn that we do indeed assign different grades of animacy, aliveness, and humanness, as well as ability, that we do this linguistically. This is a quote: "An adult male who is free as opposed to enslaved, able-bodied and with intact linguistic capacities, one who is also familiar, who is individual and positioned nearby, stands at the top of this hierarchy as the most animate or active agent within the grammars of ordering." This is from Chen's book called Animacies, Biopolitics, Racial Mattering, and Queer Affect. To take away someone's agency, we dehumanize them by means of objectifying them and or referring to them in mass terms. An example would be how we often hear the term vegetable referring to people in a coma, for example, or when we refer to groups as if they were a homogeneous mass of exact identical copies of each other, such as, for example, Muslims or women or animals. These terms of massification deactivate agency. They deny the power to act on one's own behalf. Carol Adams actually speaks about this in The Sexual Politics of Meat. Really interesting read if you're new to animal liberation. Anyway, these are just a couple of examples of how language is used to dehumanize as a means of taking away agency, to take away the possibility to consent and to resist. In other words, when we dehumanize someone through language, we disable them from partaking in communication. Okay, so we learn, or in dominant communication, I mean. Okay, so let me check. We learn to categorize ourselves and each other through the linguistic structures we learn. I would also like to point out that the natural sciences teach us what distinguishes us as humans from other species and inanimate objects. Quick side note, actually, science also uses grammar and syntax to communicate its findings, and scientists are individuals influenced by the structure of their society, just like every single one of us. Science is the search for knowledge about the natural. It is based on perceiving a phenomenon, testing it, describing it, naming it, and so discovering it and describing its purpose. Science tells us that species and ability are both naturally given. They are facts of life. For instance, some people are born with cerebral palsy or will go blind during their lifetime. That is a fact. It is also a fact that an individual categorized as Homo sapiens has a different hormonal balance than an individual categorized as a frog or a spider. Makes sense. Those are facts of the body. They are organic and in that sense natural. What is not natural, however, is the way someone with cerebral palsy or without eyesight, or someone who is a frog or a spider, is given less access to navigating dominant society. They are excluded. They are excluded from participating in society to different degrees based on the nature of their being. This line of thought is very dangerous in essence. It justifies violence. However, historically, we see this process time and again applied to different homogenized groups. If one is dehumanized linguistically or biologically, one is less likely to be considered a person with individual desires, goals, and agendas. And so one is less likely to be included in dominant society. Based on this, a lot of anti-discrimination and inclusion work is advocating for rights and personhood. By this logic, those who are human enough are granted rights to influence the shape and form of the society they live in. The idea is then that we as individuals have to prove our humanness. We have to prove that we have the capacities to express ourselves enough to be understood by the dominant culture. In other words, we have to assimilate to be considered of moral value. Assimilation is not the process. Assimilation is not the process of making equal, but rather the process of homogenization, of becoming the same. When we assimilate ourselves or are assimilated, we mask our differences in thought, we hide our bodies, we deny our perception of the world and our desires in favor of being perceived as more human and so being granted more agency. So who decides how science and language categorizes us as more or less human, more or less deserving of rights, privilege, and moral consideration? Now, I am speaking from a Eurocentric perspective. When I'm speaking of the dominant culture, I'm speaking of a supremacy of white patriarchal imperialism and capitalist masculinism. And because this is a bit wordy and still not a complete list of humanizing traits, I used to dehumanize those who can't or are not willing to comply. I like to speak about the figure of the human with brackets around the H and the U. I'll show you this on my screen. There we go. Can you see this slide? So, next slide, here we go. Oh, sorry. Okay, I did not think this through properly. I have papers everywhere and now my notes are gone. Give me 1 second. Okay, so I find this way, this human way of referring to the humanized and privileged subject useful because it stresses the patriarchal aspect of power that entails white imperialist and capitalist ideas, and it includes species membership as a defining factor of privilege and agency. Most importantly, the focus in our thinking when we speak about the kind of perpetrator of an injustice shifts from the oppressed group to the oppressor, to the one imposing the living conditions onto the marginalized party. Like in all liberation struggles, the oppressor, who has been imperceptible and non-evident, is first identified and named and then held accountable and put in charge of interrupting the cruelty experienced by those marginalized. And if we just speak of systems and this kind of idea of something that's bigger than us, then there's nobody to hold accountable. That was kind of my thought behind it. And really, if we think about humanness as a social construct signifying agency instead of a biological category, then we can conclude that it is actually these traits here on this slide that distinguish us from animals more than the items we saw on the first list, like spirituality, our anatomy, and I don't know, the fact that we share an economy, for example. Discrimination against non-normative cognitive and bodily abilities and non-normative species belonging, assuming the human is the normative subject, is so difficult to identify because differences in ability and species are still naturalized, and so their exclusion from dominant society goes unnoticed and is being justified. The key word here is naturalized. Similar to other natural differences, such as those of the color of your eyes or your skin. Differences in ability as well as species are natural. They occur in nature and are not necessarily manufactured. However, the superiority of one individual over another based on this natural difference is indeed manufactured. The artifice of this system becomes clear when we distinguish between the medical model and the social model of understanding disability. The medical model holds that a disability is the result of a physical condition that causes the affected individual to experience a decreased quality of life. This model makes disability a biological and thus intrinsic part of the disabled person. It becomes a personal problem. It naturalizes the circumstances, placing the focus of the narrative on the lack the person is organically experiencing. This train of thought assumes a normative state, one that is more complete and better, and one that the disabled person diverges from. The social model of disability, however, acknowledges that natural differences between people do exist, but then shows that people are disabled, are actually being made less able by the environment they are placed in. This approach does not assume disability to be a lack or fault compared to a normative body or mind, but rather acknowledges that barriers are created by society. That the focus here lies not on the disabled person to prove their disability or their willingness to overcome this disability, but rather on the normative human to make society more accessible and inclusive. Following the medical model then, disability, bodily bodily non-conformity and abnormalities and a misfitting into one's environment under capitalism are constructed as impairments and drawbacks, a lack. Disability is pathologized and so becomes something that is to be treated with different forms of therapy in order to be cured or otherwise overcome. This also means then that the responsibility is placed again with the disabled person to become abled enough to participate in society, instead of society to become inclusive enough to make our socio-political infrastructures accessible to disabled people, or for dehumanized individuals and for individuals of other species. So Nora Taylor makes clear the fallacy of this medical and very kind of human understanding of disability by juxtaposing the concepts of cognitive empathy and learned adjustment. Cognitive empathy and learned adjustment. With cognitive empathy, with this approach to disability, an able-bodied person will assume that and imagine what it would be like to be disabled. But as Taylor reminds us, quote, this imagining might not be accurate, and more important, it is only possible with disabilities and injuries with which we ourselves are familiar, ones that are diagnosable and recognizable within our culture. So ones that have already been named and defined and discovered. End quote. Whereas with a learned adjustment approach towards disability, to put it very simply, the able-bodied person will refrain from assumptions about the disabled person they encounter and instead adjust their behavior to accommodate the other person. It is the human medical model based on cognitive empathy that makes room for the idea that disability and animality are comparable, as we measure ability based on performance criteria that are constructed as specifically neurotypical, able-bodied, and human, so belonging to the species Homo sapiens. A growing number of disability and animal activists, including Taylor, urge us to turn our backs on this train of thought, as it is the crux of many rights and personhood debates for and against the ethical consideration of disabled and or animal individuals, and will always lead only to the elevation and moral status of some and the continued disregard for others. So for example, an able-bodied chimpanzee or a dolphin could be considered highly intelligent and might so be granted more status than a cognitively disabled person. To make the stuff of today's event even more complex, let us consider some examples of how non-human animals are affected by disability as well as how human animals are disabled for caring about non-humans. As we already saw tonight, animals in captivity, this can also include actually our kind of companion animals at home, routinely pathologized and diagnosed with madness when, for example, acting out against their oppressors. When captive animals become harmful towards their humans, or towards the humans that hold them prisoner, or when they self-harm, these animals are routinely diagnosed. They are put on medication to tame them, make them more manageable, or they are disabled physically by common practices such as debeaking or dehorning, for example. Often, of course, the cheapest option is to kill the resisting animal. Either way, all three scenarios remove agency from the animals and disable them. I promised myself not to give graphic descriptions of violence against animals today, so I'll very briefly just say this. Bodies that are so far animalized that they are constructed as edible, for example, chickens, cows, and pigs in a Eurocentric context, are consistently subjected to the brutal treatment by their keepers. Their built environments are also physically very oppressive, and especially if we consider the kind of hormonal treatment, the hormonal medicine that is given to many animals that we call livestock, it manufactures their physiology and anatomy to such an extent that they are disabled in the name of profit. Chloe Taylor and Kelly Strathers-Munford succinctly summarize how the animal farming industry contributes to disability of humans and non-humans. Quote, all of this disabling of animals takes place in an industry that pollutes the environment, which can produce further disability in order to produce foods that cause health problems for consumers, and hence even more disability, and so on. The high rates of repetitive strain injuries and disabling workplace accidents in slaughterhouses, as well as the psychological harms caused by industrial slaughter of animals, are always noted in vegan and animal activist literature. This is from their essay on veganism as universal design. People refusing to participate. So this is me again, the quote just ended. People refusing to participate in this industry are also routinely pathologized. For example, diagnoses such as orthorexia nervosa, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, and other selective eating disorders are frequently given by medical professionals if one refuses to partake in carnism, which is the speciesist act of consuming the bodies of those who have been animalized. And let us not forget that many animal liberation activists, bearing witness to the cruelty against animals and disrupting it through direct action, also suffer from the results of the trauma they experience. Not only is it secondary trauma from bearing witness to someone else's suffering, but also do their own bodies have to withstand the force of those securing the continuation of animal industries, such as farmers or livestock lorry drivers, zoo and aquarium keepers, and animal trainers in circuses. And the law enforcement that secures that these businesses can run smoothly. Not rarely, judicially, the structures are in place to also long-term criminalize activists who are then removed from society and incapacitated. Further experiences like these then lead to PTSD, anxiety, panic, depression, just to name a couple of examples. Okay, I realized that my time is coming to an end, and I kind of said I would like to share a bit of the story about the two animals I lived with. And also because I didn't want to end on such a sad note. So I would just kind of like to check if we should go to the Q&As now, and maybe I can speak about the animals then, or should I read? It's a couple of pages. I kind of took extracts from an essay I wrote.
We're thinking.
we're thinking about it. We're thinking we might start a Q&A because if we open up the floor for questions, so participants in the audience can also still send us questions. I think you have an eye on the questions.
I'm trying to keep an eye on the questions. I have to say that it's already going pretty well. People are asking tons of questions, but because we're joined by important people, Geertrui is also in the chat and has already taken upon herself to answer some of the questions. I also heard that Sarat Koling is also in the chat, in the Zoom watching, and she's the author of Animal Resistance in the Global Capitalist Era, which Geertrui referred to at the very end of her lecture. So we're in good company. There's already 10 questions asked and 10 questions answered by Geertrui almost by herself.
So it's just happening over there. They're already answering questions.
Maybe it's good if y'all specify to whom you're asking the question, or else Geertrui is going to end up having to do all the work by herself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you have any more questions for Agnes, please specify your questions
Yes,
for Agnes. And I think I want to start by asking Agnes a question, the question about which you didn't have the time to touch upon during your talk, namely your personal experiences, and also maybe giving us a bit of insight in your own personal trajectory. How did you come to thinking disability studies and critical animal studies together? How did you come to thinking disability rights and animal rights together? Is Agnes still here?
I love the Zoom live. We don't know what's happening.
Hi, I muted myself. Hi, I'm here. Yeah, thanks for the interesting questions, and thanks again for having me. Really wonderful panel.
Yeah, thank you for your wonderful talk, by the way. We forgot to say that. Yeah.
So there's kind of two questions. Perhaps I'll first say a little bit about how I came to think animal liberation and disability liberation, how I kind of explored the intersection. Perhaps actually both questions are very similar because it both came from my personal experience, and with the kind of medical industrial complex, but also with the animals that I was exposed to. I think the crux of my thought behind this is, like I said in the lecture, that being animal and being disabled is still seen as exclusively natural. It's exclusively like a fact of life, an organic thing that happens to us. And like with any other liberation movement, the next step is kind of to say, okay, we have differences, but we are also suffering because there is a social construct in place that keeps these differences, that categorizes these differences into hierarchies. And I think with disability and species belonging, this still needs to happen, this moment of saying, okay, actually, we are building the roads, we are making the roads inaccessible to somebody using a wheelchair, or we are deforesting habitats for animals. We speak about these things, but we are still very kind of inactive as a society, if that makes sense. So that was kind of the urgency that I saw behind this. And then I also had the pleasure to meet a couple of animals a few years ago now. One of them was a dog who was quite disabled. She couldn't, she was missing an eye, she couldn't walk straight. She had suffered a stroke, and the vet kind of said, oh, you know, she will die any minute. But she wasn't in pain, or, you know, she was still eating, she was still interacting, but that was kind of the stamp she was given. And when I met her, this is how I was introduced to her. But then I kind of, I got to know her, which was very different to other dogs, because dogs communicate with their ears, their tails, they move very differently to the way that she did. And that was a learning experience for me, and I had a lot of ableism to undo in myself in the way that I met her. What was interesting for me was the way that other people saw me taking care of this dog. And there was one crucial moment, and then I'll zip it for now. There was one crucial moment with this dog where her hind legs had gotten so weak that we got her a wheelchair, and she started moving in the wheelchair. And this is where I noticed that the perception from other people changed from, oh, you are just keeping this dog alive because you need to feel needed, or, you know, everyone had to say something kind of quite horrible to me and about the dog, like as if she doesn't have any value because she ruptured this idea that we have of how a companion dog is supposed to be, because she couldn't wag her tail, or because she needed so much care, which is seen as a burden. And then as soon as she started using the wheelchair, her movement had changed a bit, and everyone was kind of doing this very typical fetishization of a disabled body. Oh wow, she's such a little fighter, and she's doing so well. All of a sudden, like, the opinions really changed, and that was quite a fascinating moment to witness.
I don't know if I have a question. I think it's more of a comment, perhaps also one of appreciation. Like, I appreciated in your lecture and in some of your writing that we were fortunate enough to that you shared with us before this event, that you are very specific about the white supremacist sort of underlayings of both the process by which people are animalized and animals are disabled and so forth, and just sort of the intricacies thereof, and sort of putting it in the context of the sort of hierarchy and the Western European white supremacist sort of traditions of science and whatnot. And I appreciate that because I had just had a moment when we were watching the very first lecture by Geertrui, and we were watching the story of Tyke, and we saw this very public display of an execution of this elephant, you know, as a sort of ritualistic, well, made me think a lot about the ritualistic sort of dimension to the killings of Black people, and the filming of it, and the ways in which specifically in the United States, for example, or in the European context as well, whether it's in the streets or, you know, on the boats, people traveling to the Mediterranean Sea. But this sense of, like, we have law and order to contain these less than human, more animalized kind of people. And it just, I was kind of like Geertrui's, you know, the picture that she showed of Tyke?
I think Tyke, yeah.
Tyke's death, and sort of the you know, just sort of how the whole apparatus of government violence sort of kicked in, and to just execute this person made me think about how Black people and animalized people, as I think you would say as well. So I'm appreciative of that context. But at the same time, I guess I'm a little bit conflicted because, you know, there are ways in which the ideas, the construct of Black bodies and brown bodies as animalistic, as dangerous, as, for example, what's her name? She was almost president of the United States. She ran for presidency against Trump. The wife.
Oh, Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton.
I'd already repressed the memory.
Yeah, I know. who in the 90s spoke of young Black men as super predators, right? Super predators. They needed to be contained. And Biden also at the time spoke of young Black men as super predators. But it's really interesting how the violence enacted against these Black bodies to sort of contain them and to confirm to white supremacy and to white people that, you know, these animals, near animals are these wild animals are kind of like contained, is when the white human is enacts extreme violence, for example, shooting at people at schools and so on. They're sort of put in this disability frame, which kind of creates sympathy of some sort, creates a sense of like, oh, well, they had a really hard time, and
they had mental health issues.
They had mental health issues, and sort of, yeah, and you don't see the government apparatus kick in to just, you know, decimate this person in the same way or
And I think when it's connected towards brown bodies, having mental health issues might be a reason to shoot.
Yeah, exactly, because
So
then
it's
you're
turn
afraid,
around,
because which was inherently the defense of Zimmerman when killing I forget the name, but Zimmerman was most famous for having been able. He was not a police officer; he was just a person in the neighborhood. Kills a young man, and then later can go and say, "I was terrified by him. He scared me. He was so big, he could have killed me." Well, there was no evidence that this young man wanted to kill him in any way. And so this, yeah, it's just sort of I don't know how to understand that. Does that make sense? Where I'm like,
Absolutely. It has. I think you kind of pointed you pointed out the intersection again of speciesism and how we dehumanize humans who are already by nature human, and how we create these hierarchies, and then the same rules don't apply to the same kind of group of people, and we distinguish between, I don't know, skin color, and then use labels such as mentally ill also as a perhaps not so much. I never actually thought about it as a forgiving kind of trait, that we say, oh, Zimmerman was mentally ill, and or some shooter was mentally ill, and that's why he acted out. But I also kind of see that as it's very damaging towards the disabled community, and
Definitely.
so again, like these layers of dehumanization are all just piled up on top of each other, and I think that's why it's really important that we acknowledge all of them and work together, and not there's this kind of tendency in animal rights to be just for the animals, and to put animals first, which has been kind of decreasing recently. But I think this is really important, exactly because we need to work together and acknowledge that we are also oppressed on so many different layers. Like exactly what you just described is unbelievably complex.
Yeah, I really enjoyed you bringing speciesism into this conversation of all the different isms, which we, I think, already think about. But on the other hand, I know that for a lot of disability studies scholars, but also disability rights activists, opening up discussions about animality and disability is really fraught territory. I remember a few years ago, I think it was the Animality and Disability Studies Conference, and it was posted online and in different lists, and disability studies scholars were really, opening up these discussions. Should we bring those two together? Isn't this very dangerous? Thinking back about this long prehistory of being animalized as a way of making sure people with disabilities are thought of as less than. But also, I think, which I told you just before we started, the Peter Singer trauma, which for people who don't know, Agnes might want to explain why disability studies people, when they hear animal rights, they think of Peter Singer and they're a bit hesitant to start the conversation between animal rights and disability rights. So maybe you can elaborate on that a bit. And I also maybe would like to hear, what do you say to people who are fraught or hesitant to open up this conversation because of the danger that lies therein?
So first of all, Peter Singer is a very kind of problematic figure in the animal rights movement, and he mostly because there's a lot of stuff to unpack, but I think what you are kind of pointing towards is the fact that he's very incredibly ableist. He works with this assumption of cognitive performance, for example, performance criteria that we use to base our moral consideration of individuals on. So, for example, I think I mentioned there's a lot of talk about chimpanzees or dolphins having like IQs or being really hyper intelligent, and that making them more deserving of rights. That is the kind of Peter Singer narrative. So by that logic, and he openly kind of says that by that logic, children that are not at this kind of high level of intelligence. I say intelligence because again, that is also such a social construct, and it's also a barrier to making a community, to making society more inclusive and loving. And Peter Singer exactly says that we should exclude these people very brutally by death, by killing them and not giving them any moral consideration because they drain our resources or whatever, to put it in a kind of capitalist context. Yeah, it's awful. It's been a long time since Singer was since he started writing, not to justify this, but there are many other authors who are doing really great work right at the intersection of disability and animality. And what was the second question? Why it's important? Why? Yeah, and what to say to kind of people who are hesitant.
And how to navigate maybe the dangers that could be inherent in opening up conversations about animality and disability.
Yeah, that's really difficult, and it's something that these dangers that you mean that you are speaking about. I suppose you mean kind of comparing a person, a disabled person, to an animal. That is dehumanizing. That's exactly what it is, and the danger in that is it arises from this inherent speciesism that really is kind of at the basis of all of our isms, of all of the oppressions that we as one individual might experience. So every time we are dehumanized, this is a result of speciesism. This is a result of giving more moral consideration to those who are considered human, or like more human than others. And I think that is already the answer. Like seeing that we dehumanize people leads us to the idea that there is a speciesism that we need to undo. And maybe kind of fighting speciesism is not just kind of an act of solidarity or allyship with animals, but also with ourselves and with the parts of us that are dehumanized on a daily basis.
Yeah, I have to say, like, I struggle a little bit with. You talked a little bit earlier about people who go like, I choose for the animals. I do everything for the animals, and a little bit. And for me, I don't know how to explain this, but the last thing you just said about it all being speciesism, it's really difficult, especially when you see so many of these sort of animal liberation and climate change advocates and communities take stances that are, or approach their efforts towards conservationism, for example, or towards reducing the global, human footprint on the biodiversity and so on, and approach it from a very fascist, but also very racist sort of way. Like there's a documented, very well documented, human rights abuses by conservation groups that fund and train and organize and kind of, legitimize extreme violence for communities that are living very much near all these endangered species and so on, and that these communities are constructed as the enemies of these endangered species, while save the jungle, save the rainforests for the orangutan, but not necessarily for the Native American communities or the indigenous communities that have been living there for thousands of years in harmony with these animals and whatnot. Like there are some of these groups. The WWF is one that has been. There's been many accusations, and all over the world, whether it's in places like Zimbabwe or in India or in Latin America, where over and over again, we find them training paramilitary groups that are, conservationists, and that have almost like they execute people like that are, poachers and whatnot, and just execute them at will. And I find that very difficult to be like, okay, so, like what happens when we find these kind of Peter Singers type of people and want to meet them halfway and talk about animality, disability, but perhaps also racism and all those type of things. It gets very...
Yeah, I completely agree. And what I also struggle with, and this is a tension I don't know how to resolve, and I'm not sure anybody here can. I mean, if Agnes can resolve it, please do.
That would be great.
It's a tension between in this vocabulary of fighting against the disablement of animals, for instance, of farm animals that are raised to be disabled or are disabled in the process of being kept as farm animals, which I'm also against, let's be clear about this, or the discourse of pollution, which should be stopped because it disables people in the long term, which I'm also against, let's be clear. But having that position and that conversation at the same time as not positioning disability as this terrible state which we want to avoid at all costs. So how do we keep those two, the tension between those two? How do we, maybe we don't need to resolve it, but how do we think about it? It's something that I hear a lot when I hear the discourses in animal rights groups and also environmental groups.
Well, I'm just to add further tension, because that's what we're doing here today.
We're layering tension.
But for example, when I became vegan about 7 years ago, and I remember meeting, and I still do. That's why the reason why I really don't have a lot of, I don't really get involved in vegan activism, because there's so many promises that are held to people. Like if you become vegan, then you won't have these and these disabilities anymore, or you will never have this illness. And the reason why all these people are sick is because they're not vegan. And it's just so... It is so ableist, and it's very difficult because they have all kinds of scientific, obviously, science is deeply ableist and speciesist and whatnot. But so it's almost impossible to have conversations with these people because they're so convinced of veganism as a diet that is not only in solidarity with animals, but is supposed to be the cure-all and end-all for everything.
Yeah, I think so. I am vegetarian, I'm veganish, I always say. I try to be vegan as often as possible. And I also don't feel really welcomed in most kind of vegan spaces, because you have this, on the one hand, there's a lot of body shaming in vegan spaces, a lot of fat phobia in vegan spaces, and a lot of disability fear-mongering, if you don't eat like this, you'll become like me, you'll become disabled, and that's a terrible thing to happen to you. So I definitely get where you're coming from.
I think for me it's very difficult to imagine at the moment, and that's not on you, Agnes. I think that your proposal for a humanity, and I read it with a lot of interest, and sort of turning the speculum back on the white human with HU between brackets. I found it super interesting, but I really find it very difficult to imagine strategies of mobilizing animalized human beings, disabled human beings, with animal liberationists when there are so many...
These layers of tension.
These layers of tension, as we call them,
Maybe Agnes wants to comment to all our worries and fears.
Sorry, Agnes, sorry. Do you want to... We don't have much time left, by the way, so maybe we should also perhaps let you off the hook and give you some of the questions from the Q&A. You pick which one you would rather have.
I was just going to say that I agree with everything that you both just said, like all these tensions, all these complexities, and I'm also experiencing them, and also not knowing how to answer these questions. And my experience with animal rights was also very, very similar. The first experience I had, I came into a group that was kind of, on the outside quite diverse, if I can say that, but on the inside, all these isms came out so quickly, and it was all humans first and whatnot, until actually a discussion erupted about inviting quite a known Nazi to the demo that we were organizing, and unfortunately, only that was the point where I said, okay, I am with the wrong crowd here. But I didn't know this was my first introduction to animal rights, and then I kind of had to distance myself as well, and develop new thought. But yeah, I think it's all it's a process, and perhaps veganism is not something that is like a moral baseline, but like we saw in the other presentation, we should think of solidarity. We should think of allyship, not just with the animals, but with each other, and do our best, so to speak. Yeah.
And I think I also see maybe one way of reclaiming animality as a person with a disability, because when I'm often very interested in how people with disabilities describe their disabilities, because we just have this medical and administrative jargon to think about our bodies. Even the word disability itself is like medical and administrative jargon. We don't have that much literary language to think about our bodies. And when I hear people with disabilities talk about their embodiment in a more literary way, they often refer to animals as other ways of being. I've heard people with disabilities refer to themselves as bats, as octopuses, as seals, as just trying to find other ways of being embodied in the world, and they find that I think in the natural world that are also valued to a certain extent. So I don't know, maybe if we can reclaim animality, there might be in a more literary fashion that it can be reclaimed for people with disabilities. Although I also reckon that it could be way more fraught for people with disabilities of color.
Yeah, So I think for me, that's definitely what I immediately think of, like animality, claiming animality. That is so tricky, including also claiming disability. Like, I found it very interesting, Agnes. In the very beginning, you explained that you gave this quote, and people are actually asking where the quote is from about denying our disabilities.
The Rosemary Garland Thompson quote.
That's right.
Yeah, but could somebody write that down in the chat, because I can't pronounce that what you just said just now. But
if I had something, I could write it down.
Yeah, but
I hope somebody else
what is
will.
difficult? I heard you say about how it gave you access to a lot of privileges as someone who's perceived as able-bodied or able-minded. And I have to say, like, I think it's taken years for me to be able to be vocal about my mental health disabilities, or in so much as you might call that. But anyways, I have a long list of many diagnoses of varying levels of and sometimes contradictory. But anyways, and I have to say that if I look back on having it taken about 32 or 33 years, I'm 37 now, about 32 or 33 years to be able to be vocal about that, I think a lot about the ways in which Black people, in the kind of ways that Black people are just to be able to be heard and understood, to be legible, the kind of ways that you have to pass for all kinds of things, right? And sane is the minimum. Definitely non-animalistic is the other. And I'm not sure whether I would construe that as having, therefore, have had the privilege of saneness or whatever. But I think, like, because the repression of my disabilities ended up me being involuntarily committed for 7 months of my life. Ended up me having years, like 3 or 4 years, of not being able to have my own bank account and so on. And because it takes a toll, there's a cost to try to pass and hide your disabilities, so that you can have. I'm not sure if I would call it having privilege, but just to not be, as a Black person, to not be, or, as an insane person, to not be set aside and excluded, be segregated, and so on and so on. So I don't know, like, so does that make sense?
I think it makes sense. I mean, there are real advantages in identifying a way from an oppressed group. I think that happens with disability a lot. People identify away from disability a lot because it gives you more advantage to not identify with disability. And it might be, in some sense, same way with animality, that you might want to identify away from animality because it gives you real advantages to not identify or be identified as animalistic.
Because there are very real ways in which Black people, particular behaviors, particular ways of talking, particular ways of being that are to this very day very much connected as expressions of animality for Black people. And I could not perform those things and be sitting here and having a conversation at Kai Theater. I could not, you know? Like I have to pass.
And I think for disability, I mean, it's also a double-edged sword. It's often also when I talk about people talking about their bodies as animalistic in a way to reclaim it as a way of an alternative way of being in the world. It's also often the reclaiming of slurs. And it often starts out as a slur. I mean, you eat like a monkey, you walk like a seal. It starts out as a slur and it gets reclaimed then. But I think you have to be at a certain place of safety to be able to reclaim such a thing.
Okay, Agnes, we really need to ask you some of the questions. There's the questions are piling up. And it's our fault. And at some point, I think that the Kai Studios will just shut this whole thing down because we're over time.
The lights will go out any minute.
It's like, stop it. Go get a real job. No. So for Agnes, the first question we have here, I hope I pronounced this properly. Would the biopsychosocial model be optimal to pursue as opposed to the medical or social model, since it incorporates not only the impairments as well as the necessary societal social changes, but also incorporates psychological and cognitive considerations? Is that something you want to answer, or? Because you can always say no, like I don't want to answer that question next. That's always fine.
It's fine. So the question is whether, sorry, I can't see them, whether or not the social
the biopsychosocial model is optimal.
Biopsychosocial.
Yeah.
Okay, so if the person can still hear me, I was kind of speaking about the social model and the medical or kind of biological model. So kind of to separate these two, unless I misunderstanding the question. No, okay. So I was kind of speaking about the social model that would take away this idea of disability being a lack or an impairment, like an intrinsic impairment.
But I think what the person asking the question is that the social model does not incorporate psychological and cognitive considerations.
Okay, so I think it does. I think disability studies has perhaps a bit later, or more recently, included madness studies and this kind of idea, reclaiming again this idea of not just being cripped, but also being mad and having mental disabilities. So am I answering the question?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think so, yes.
I think in the literature and in the activism, it is included.
But it took a while, right?
It took a while.
Exactly.
It took a while also to bring back the body into disability studies. But I think by now it has been incorporated into the social model that we also need to talk about the psychological, about embodiment, and about pain and suffering as well.
Okay, cool. The next question is, it's first of all, I thank you for the amazing talk. In your PhD thesis, you discussed phallogocentrism. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Phallogocentrism.
Phallogocentrism. These are big words, people. And McCormack's ahumanism. We, me and Aaron Noor, were wondering, how do you see human relations now, if they are always doomed to phallogocentric logic, or if there's a way forward for multi-species communities? In other words, is the human-animal relation to be avoided by withdrawing ourselves from such interactions, or is to be changed by engaging differently? And this question is asked by Maria Martelli and Aaron Noor.
Thank you for the question. This is also something that I ask myself frequently. I think this idea of the a-human, maybe to kind of quickly summarize it to people who have not read McCormack's work, or when I quote Patricia McCormack, the a-human is the idea of kind of turning away, of letting the other be, but still acknowledging them. So acknowledging that we are in this world together, that we share space, but without me perhaps making assumptions, reflecting something onto the other that I meet. So it's a very philosophical concept. And that's why this question is really interesting, because when I interact specifically with animals, for example, I try to see to what extent I can actually practice this. And we share space with animals. Perhaps an example would be that I have a companion dog at home. We live together, and he can't say to me, "Oh." Well, he does communicate to me that he wants to go outside, but he can't like open the door on his own, right? So in that sense, he's kind of dependent on me perceiving his communication to me. So there, the idea of the a-human, of just turning away and letting him be, is not practicable in a way of just leaving the other be. But the other thought that I had was, for example, when I was going to say recently, but we've been in lockdown for a long time. I remembered when I traveled and I met this stray dog, and often there's a lot of stray cats in places, and you kind of this human instinct that you have, this human in brackets instinct that you have, is to, I don't know, save them, rescue them. You think, oh, they are not doing well, or they need a home, they need to be domesticated. And then one time I met this stray dog who was just kind of doing their thing on this busy road, like asking people for food and then going off. And then on the next day I saw them do the same kind of spiel again. And that was kind of where I caught myself having this human instinct of, oh, does this dog need something? Can I do something for them? Can I care for them? And then I had to kind of, if that makes sense, do the a-human thing and say, okay, this dog lives here. I am kind of a guest in their space. I am passing by. I am passing through their space, and they know what they are doing here, and I am just projecting my assumptions on them. I don't know if that makes sense, or if I'm just, it's such a philosophical topic, and I know that when I write about it, it's not very graspable. So I hope I kind of made this a bit more practical now.
Just a decolonial perspective on this, if I could. I know we're over time. I'm so sorry. They're looking at us like, please finish this. No, but I'm just thinking a lot about the first times that I started reading Chinua Achebe, who was this African, specifically Nigerian writer of the 50s, and who's still amazing. And I would really recommend it. Read Chinua Achebe's books. But what is really finding interesting is how he sort of situates human to animal relationships in a pre-colonial time in the Yoruba traditions, in the Nigerian traditions, as one where sacredness was really important, right? So where, for example, a snake, if you found a snake in your compound, you couldn't kill a snake because a snake was considered sacred, was considered to be the embodiment of this goddess, I don't remember exactly which goddess, or the relationship to trees, to lakes, to certain mountains, to certain just general geographic formations and constellations as sacred, and ascribing value, intrinsic value to those places and holiness, and sort of prescribing certain ways of taking things from those spaces because they're sacred. And I think I wonder for the European sort of discourse right now in trying to figure out how to deal with the non-human world, and whether it's non-human animals or geographic constellations, whether that which the early Europeans thought superstition and sort of an animated way of looking at the world as being sort of not Christian, perhaps could be some of the ways in which that balance and that sort of those problems of phallogocentric logic and projections and so on could be fixed, where like a certain sense of sacredness to that which is all that is living, and may be part of the ways in which people, I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there. I don't know if it's helpful. I don't understand half of these words being used right now, so. We have one more question.
I think this might have to be the final question.
This must be the final question. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So this is for all the panelists, but since I spoke so much, I think I'll leave it to you too. The question is from Carl. It's so embedded in society's discourse to deny agency for both people with disabilities as well as animals other than humans, that to even refer to animals other than humans as people provokes resistance and even anger from speciesist recipients. Do you have a solution to help these oppressed groups reclaim their agency and personhood without resulting or enacting any hierarchical oppressions of our own? Yeah, I think we've been talking about that the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any concrete. If I have to make it a bit more concrete, maybe, I would like to also pose this question to Agnes, but also add to it, you know, just some in a more practical manner. What do you want disability movements to take away from animal rights movements and vice versa, I think?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Yeah, it's the stuff of what we've been. It's the stuff that we've been discussing
all night.
All night, yeah. I think I always love this question. Do you have a solution? I am always the first one to say I have a solution for nothing. I am good at observing what kind of perhaps needs to change to make us all feel a little better, but then how to change it is the next kind of step. And
general researchers are terrible at solutions. We need activists for them.
Yeah. But I have to say, I was particularly charmed by the solution I think it's in your writing, where you talk about really sort of learning more and studying better the human, because the human has become neutral and sort of, you know, absent. I think you call them the absent reference. And
but that's actually Carol Adams.
Yeah.
It's about absent reference, the animals.
Yeah, because I find myself often testifying to the ways in which I exist in an oppressed world, but I rarely find the time or find other white people or non-disabled people kind of really examining who they are and what sort of and how they come to be. And I think that could be something that could really be fruitful as a way to just really to just sort of take off the mask of rationality and of humanness, of elevated humanness, the best humanness of the white patriarchal, economically contributing patriarch.
Definitely, I think turning around the mirror is always
very
helpful.
Good. Which means also, I think, also for ourselves.
Sure. Yeah.
To take a good look at who we think we are and how we came to think that that's who we are, and that that's valid and better than.
And I think also, I mean, the concept that has come up a few times this evening, but we haven't really delved into, is dependency and autonomy. So I think also really thinking about what dependency means, and if we have other ways of looking at it, and maybe coming to towards an ethics that's more based on interdependency and not on the notions of a mutual contract that should be based on equal contribution to the contract. So
yeah. And vulnerability also, perhaps, also.
I think so.
But okay.
Okay.
Listen, I have to round things up. That's my privilege for tonight. Agnes, thank you so much for your beautiful,
so much.
and also your patience with us to kind of just making things more and more complicated. and thank you for taking the time to answer these complicated questions from the audience as well. I also, like, there are many people all around us that you cannot see, technicians, staff, Goedele, who's, made this beautiful programming already for so long that we need to thank and should thank as well. Yes, thank you. I just want to say that there's one more, not one more, but there's the next in the series of the More Than Human Encounters is on the 25th of March of 2021 at 8 o'clock around the same time. And it's entitled On Race, Species and Becoming Human. That's an evening with Zakia Iman Jackson and Tunde Adifioye. Aside from all the evenings in the series are my favorite evenings. So this one is also my favorite. So be there, okay? Thank you. To you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye. Oh, and thank you for watching, everyone.
Yeah. Let's not forget the audience.
Yes,
Thanks for your
and for the great,
questions.
difficult questions.
Yeah, the questions. I always feel like I can't do them justice. Sorry.
I have to say that Geertrui helped a lot. So that's also somebody who we particularly need to thank for a lot of the questions that were here. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.